The last time my daughter slammed the door in my face, the sound didn't echo. It settled. It settled in my chest like dust, like something that would never quite clear no matter how hard I breathed. I remember standing there on her porch, my hand still raised in the shape of a knock that never landed, listening to my own heart thump louder than the silence she left behind. That was the day I learned how loud rejection can be when it comes from your own children. I didn't cry right away. I walked to my car slowly, as if moving too fast might break whatever dignity I had left. The sun was too bright for a moment like that, and I remember thinking how unfair it was that the world didn't dim itself when a mother's heart cracked open. 9 years later, I stood at the back of a church I was no longer invited into, watching my granddaughter walk down the aisle, and every breath I took tasted like memory. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I became the mother they stopped answering, before I was the name spoken in sighs and silences, I was just Mom, the kind who burned the bottom of the toast because she was listening too closely to her children's stories, the kind who folded laundry while humming even when my back ached because a quiet house felt wrong to me. I raised my children in a modest home that always smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Nothing fancy. Brown couch with sagging cushions, a dining table with one leg shorter than the others, and family photos lining the hallway like witnesses to time passing. Birthdays, school plays, awkward haircuts, smiles that didn't yet know how complicated love could become. Their father, my husband, passed when the kids were still finding their way into adulthood. A heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon. No warning, no last words, just a phone call that dropped me to the kitchen floor while the kettle screamed itself dry on the stove. From that day on, I became both anchor and sail. I worked longer hours, learned how to fix things I used to call him for, and swallowed my grief so my children wouldn't have to taste it too early. I thought that was what good mothers did, carry the weight quietly. For a long time, it worked. My son called every Sunday. My daughter stopped by on Wednesdays with groceries she insisted on paying for, even though I told her I was fine. Holidays were loud and messy and full of overlapping conversations. I sat at the head of the table watching them laugh, thinking, this is what I survived for. The first crack came softly. A missed call here, a shorter conversation there. My daughter started glancing at her phone more when she visited. My son began ending calls quickly, always with something else he needed to get to. I told myself it was life, work, stress. I didn't want to be that mother, the one who clings, who asks for reassurance too often. Then came the afternoon that changed the temperature of everything. My daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tight around a mug she hadn't touched. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Mom," she said, carefully, "we've been talking." That word, we, landed wrong. She told me they were worried, that I was too dependent, that maybe it would be better if I started making other arrangements. Her voice sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced saying the words without emotion. I asked her what she meant. She sighed, finally looking up, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't prepared for. Irritation. Not concern, not sadness, just impatience. "We can't always be responsible for you," she said. Responsible? I had buried their father, paid their tuition, held them through fevers and heartbreaks and failures. And now, sitting at my own table, I felt like a burden that needed explaining away. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I asked questions quietly, like maybe if I spoke softly enough, this would turn back into a misunderstanding. But it didn't. Within weeks, conversations turned sharp. My son accused me of guilt-tripping when I asked why he hadn't visited. My daughter said I made everything about myself. They talked about me as if I wasn't in the room, about selling the house, about what's best going forward. The day I was told I couldn't stay in my own home anymore, my daughter stood with her arms crossed, her mouth tight. "You'll land on your feet. You always do." What she didn't say was, "just not here." I packed quietly, only what I could carry without asking for help. Clothes, photos, the chipped teacup my husband used every morning. When I hugged my grandchildren goodbye, they clung to me without understanding why their mother's eyes darted away. My granddaughter, the one who would grow up and walk down that aisle 9 years later, pressed her face into my coat and whispered, "Don't go too long, Nana." I smiled into her hair and told her I wouldn't. That was a lie I didn't know how to fix. I didn't disappear out of spite. I left because staying meant shrinking myself into something unrecognizable. I left because every unanswered call chipped away at something tender inside me, and I couldn't bleed quietly anymore. So I walked away. No dramatic farewell, no last argument, just silence. For 9 years, I rebuilt my life in pieces so small they barely looked like progress at first. A renting room, a new job that didn't ask about my past, evenings spent learning how to sit with myself again. And through it all, I watched my children from a distance, birthdays I wasn't invited to, milestones I learned about through secondhand whispers. I never interfered. I never announced my pain. I let them believe the story that was easiest for them, that I was fine. When the invitation arrived, addressed in unfamiliar handwriting, forwarded through someone else, my hands shook so badly I had to sit down. My granddaughter was getting married, and for the first time in 9 years, I knew it was time to come back. Not to beg, not to accuse, but to stand in the truth they had buried and let it speak for itself. I didn't open the invitation right away. It sat on my small kitchen table for 2 days, resting beside a bowl of apples that had gone soft at the bottom. Every time I walked past it, my chest tightened, not with excitement, but with the kind of caution you develop after learning how easily hope can bruise. The envelope smelled faintly of perfume, something floral and young. Not my daughter's, I knew that instantly. Her handwriting had always leaned hard to the right, sharp and impatient. This was rounder, careful, polite. Someone else had written my name. That alone told me more than the words inside ever could. By then, my life had settled into something quiet and almost unrecognizable from the woman I used to be. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a tailor shop. Every morning, the hum of sewing machines below drifted up through the floorboards like a heartbeat. I liked that sound. It reminded me that people were making things, mending what had torn. I worked at a public library 3 days a week. Nothing glamorous. I shelved books, helped children find stories about dragons and brave girls, and sat at the front desk answering questions that were usually simpler than the ones I asked myself at night. The library smelled of paper and dust and patience. It never rushed me. In the early days after I left, I had thought quiet would swallow me whole. Instead, it taught me how to listen. I learned the sound my kettle made just before it boiled, the way my knees complained on cold mornings, the comfort of reading the same page twice without anyone noticing. Loneliness didn't disappear, but it softened, like a stone worn smooth by water. I didn't talk about my children much. When coworkers asked if I had family, I said yes and let the sentence end there. I wasn't lying, I just wasn't explaining. Some nights I allowed myself memories.
My son, as a boy, standing too close to the TV, convinced he could climb into the cartoon. My daughter, braiding my hair before school, her hands clumsy but determined. The way they used to fight over who got to sit closest to their father at dinner. Other nights, I kept myself busy on purpose, scrubbing the sink, folding towels that were already folded. Grief, I learned, doesn't like being ignored, but it respects effort. The first year was the hardest. I waited for a call that never came. I kept my phone volume high, even in the shower, until one afternoon I realized I was afraid of silence more than I was afraid of rejection. So I turned the volume down. By the second year, I stopped checking social media altogether. Seeing their smiles, curated, cropped, untouched by me, felt like standing outside a house I used to own, peering through windows that no longer recognized my reflection. I heard about my granddaughter growing up through a neighbor who still spoke to my daughter. She told me about school awards, piano lessons, braces. Each update felt like a small gift wrapped in loss. I never sent letters, never showed up uninvited. Love, I decided, didn't have to announce itself to be real. Still, when I finally opened the invitation, my hands trembled. You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of... My granddaughter's name leapt off the page, bright and unfamiliar all at once. The date was circled in gold ink. The location, a church I used to drive past every Sunday without stopping. There was no personal note, no apology, no explanation, just an invitation. I sat at the table and let myself cry then, quiet tears, the kind that fall without sound, leaving your face wet and your heart oddly calm. I cried for the years I missed, for the little girl who once promised not to let me go too long, for the woman I had become without them, and for the woman I still was, whether they remembered her or not. I didn't RSVP immediately. I needed time to decide what kind of presence I would be. In the days that followed, old questions crept back in. Would they be angry, embarrassed? Would they pretend I wasn't there? Would I have to sit in the back, invisible, all over again? But there was another question underneath it all, quieter but firmer. If not now, when? I wasn't coming to disrupt anything. I wasn't coming to demand acknowledgement. I was coming because love doesn't expire just because it's been neglected. Still, doubt had a way of sneaking in. The first clue that something deeper had happened, something I hadn't fully understood back then, came from a chance conversation at the library. An older woman named Ruth, who volunteered on Thursdays, had grown fond of me. She asked careful questions, the kind people ask when they sense there's a story but don't want to pry too hard. One afternoon, as we shelved books together, Ruth said, "You remind me of my sister." I smiled politely. "Is that a good thing?" She nodded. She was pushed out by her own children. Took her years to realize it wasn't because she was weak. It was because they didn't want to feel guilty. The words landed heavier than she intended. I asked her what she meant. Ruth explained how her sister's children convinced themselves she was too much, too emotional, too present, too inconvenient, how they reframed her care as control, her need as burden. Sometimes, Ruth said, sliding a book into place, people rewrite history so they don't have to face themselves. I went home that day and sat in the dark for a long time. I replayed conversations, facial expressions, the way my daughter had avoided my eyes when she told me they'd been talking, the way my son had accused me of guilt when all I'd asked for was time. I began to wonder if my absence had been less about my dependence and more about their discomfort. The thought didn't bring anger, just clarity. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I prepared quietly. I bought a simple dress, nothing white, nothing loud, soft blue, the color my granddaughter once said made me look like the sky. I practiced steady breathing. I reminded myself that my worth did not depend on how I was received. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the city hum outside my window, my suitcase packed neatly by the door. Memories came in waves, not sharp, not cruel, just present. I remembered teaching my daughter how to apply lipstick, teaching my son how to tie a tie. Now here I was, about to witness my granddaughter step into a future I had only imagined from afar. In the morning, I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. My hair was grayer, my face softer in places, lined in others. But my eyes, they were clearer than they'd ever been. I didn't look like someone returning in defeat. I looked like someone returning whole. The church was already filling when I arrived. The sound of murmured conversations and soft laughter wrapped around me as I stepped inside. I hesitated at the doorway, my heart thudding against my ribs. Then I felt that old instinct, the one that had carried me through labor pains, hospital corridors, funerals, and farewells. I lifted my chin and walked in. I chose a seat near the back, not to hide, but to observe. My children hadn't seen me yet. I knew because their posture hadn't changed. My daughter sat stiffly in the front row, fussing with her purse. My son leaned toward his wife, whispering something I couldn't hear. And then my granddaughter appeared. She was radiant in a way that made the room feel hushed. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes scanned the pews, and for a moment they found mine. Her step faltered, just slightly. Her smile wavered, then widened, and something like disbelief flickered across her face. Tears sprang to my eyes as she mouthed a single word, "Nana." In that instant, I knew. Whatever silence had lived between me and my children, whatever stories they had told themselves, the truth was standing right there, undeniable, and it was about to be seen.
The music swelled and my granddaughter kept walking, but something had shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a storm change direction, subtle but unmistakable. Her shoulders straightened after that brief falter, and though she didn't look back again, I knew she carried the knowledge of my presence with her like a steadying hand at her back. My daughter noticed next. It wasn't dramatic, no gasp, no sudden turn, just a slow stiffening, like a body bracing before a fall. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sweeping the pews until they landed on me. For a heartbeat, we locked eyes. Her face drained of color. She looked unprepared, not angry, not relieved, just caught, as if she'd believed all these years that I existed only in memory, and now memory had taken a seat in her church. My son followed her gaze. He frowned at first, confused, then recognition spread across his face like a bruise blooming. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He leaned back, blinking hard, as though I might disappear if he adjusted his focus. I didn't wave, I didn't smile. I simply sat there, hands folded in my lap, breathing. The ceremony continued. Vows were spoken, promises made. Words about love enduring hardship, about choosing one another again and again. Each sentence felt heavier than the last, weighted with irony and truth. When the couple was pronounced married, the room erupted in applause. I stood with everyone else, clapping softly, my palms warm, my eyes wet. My granddaughter turned toward the crowd, radiant, and this time she looked straight at me. She didn't hesitate. She broke formation just slightly, enough to step out of line and rush toward me, dress rustling, veil trembling.
Gasps rippled through the audience, but she didn't care. She threw her arms around me. "Nana," she whispered into my shoulder, her voice breaking. "You came." I held her the way I used to, one hand firm between her shoulder blades, the other cradling her head. "I wouldn't miss it," I said. Behind her, I saw my daughter frozen in place, her hand half raised, as if unsure whether to intervene or retreat. My son stood rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes darting between us and the watching crowd. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. Whispers followed us into the reception hall, curious glances, that quiet electricity that runs through a room when something unplanned happens. I could feel questions forming. Who is she? Why now? I found my assigned seat, a small mercy I hadn't expected, near the edge of the room, my name printed neatly on the card. Not Mom, not Grandma, just my name. It stung, but I understood. People do what they can when they don't know how to bridge distance. The speeches began. Friends told stories. Laughter rose and fell. I smiled when appropriate, nodded politely, sipped water. I was aware of my children watching me when they thought I wasn't looking, studying my posture, my expression, as if searching for clues. I gave them none. Halfway through dinner, my son approached. He moved slowly, like someone nearing a skittish animal. He stopped at my table, cleared his throat. "Mom," he said. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. I looked up. "Hello." There was so much he could have said, so much silence between us begging for acknowledgement. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward the room. "I didn't know you were coming." I met his eyes. Neither did I until the invitation arrived. He nodded, swallowing. "We didn't think you'd want to." That almost made me laugh. "I didn't think I'd be invited," I replied. He shifted his weight, discomfort radiating off him. "You look well." "I am," I said truthfully. He hesitated, then asked the question he really came to ask. "Where have you been?" There it was. Not "why did you leave?" Not "did we hurt you?" but "where have you been?" As if distance had simply happened to us. "I've been living, quietly," I said. He nodded again, his eyes dropping to the floor. "We should talk." "Yes," I agreed, "we should." "But not here, not yet." He seemed to understand that because he didn't push. He gave a small, stiff smile and walked away, leaving behind the echo of years we hadn't spoken. My daughter didn't approach me until much later. The room had thinned, guests drifting toward the dance floor or outside for air. She stood across from me for a long moment before sitting down. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt. "You look different," she said finally. "So do you." She exhaled sharply. "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't think I'd be asked," I replied, matching her honesty with my own. She winced. "I didn't know she invited you." "Our granddaughter, then." That explained the handwriting. "She wanted me here," I said. "That's enough for me." Her daughter pressed her lips together, eyes glistening. "I didn't think she remembered you like that." I studied her face, the familiar lines, the tension she carried in her jaw. "Children remember who made them feel safe," I said gently. Silence stretched between us, thick and fragile. After a moment, she said, "We thought you were struggling." "I was," I said, "just not in the way you told yourselves." She flinched, as if struck. "I never asked you to take care of me. I asked you to let me belong." Her shoulders sagged. "We were overwhelmed." "I know." And I did, truly. Life had pulled them hard. They had children, careers, marriages, but understanding didn't erase impact. "When you left, it felt like you abandoned us." I let that sit for a moment. "Sometimes," I said softly, Stepping away is the only way to survive what staying is doing to you." She nodded slowly, tears spilling now. "I told myself you were fine, that you wanted distance." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "I didn't want distance. I needed dignity." Her breath hitched. Around us, laughter floated, glasses clinked. A song began that I recognized, one I used to hum while washing dishes. The world, it seemed, went on regardless of reckonings. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I believed her, or at least I believed she meant it in that moment. But forgiveness, I had learned, was not a switch you flipped to ease someone else's guilt. It was a door you opened when you were ready. "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here because your daughter asked me to be." She nodded, wiping her cheeks. "She's always talked about you, even when we didn't." That was the truth I hadn't known. Later that night, my granddaughter found me near the dessert table. "I hoped you'd come," she said, her voice low and earnest. "I found your old address in Mom's things. I didn't ask permission." I smiled at her courage. "Thank you." She squeezed my hand. "I missed you." "I missed you too," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. As the night wound down, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I had come, I had been seen. I hadn't begged or explained or diminished myself. The truth had done the talking, and my children, for the first time in 9 years, were listening.
The reception ended the way most celebrations do, with tired smiles, half-empty glasses, and a quiet sense that something important had passed. People hugged goodbye, shoes were kicked off under tables, and laughter softened into murmurs. I watched my granddaughter disappear into a crowd of well-wishers, her new husband's hand steady at the small of her back, and I felt an unexpected peace settle into my bones. I didn't rush to leave. For 9 years, I had learned how to move slowly, how not to flinch at pauses. I gathered my coat, thanked the server who cleared my plate, and waited near the doorway as the room thinned. My children hovered at a distance, unsure, circling like planets that hadn't yet decided whether to realign. It was my son who finally closed the gap. "Mom," he said, again, more firmly this time, "do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" The question was careful, practical, safer than the ones burning behind it. "Yes," I replied, "a small hotel nearby." He nodded, relief flashing briefly across his face. Good. We stood there, awkward and uncertain, until he cleared his throat. Would you want to come by tomorrow, just for coffee?" I considered him, the man he had become, grayer at the temples, lines around his eyes that mirrored his father's. He looked tired, older than he should have felt. "Yes," I said, "I would." My daughter joined us then, her posture stiff but her eyes hopeful. "We'll pick you up," she said quickly, as if afraid I might change my mind. "Send me the address," I replied. That night, alone in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the quiet wash over me. The room smelled faintly of lavender cleaner. Outside, traffic hummed, steady and indifferent. I kicked off my shoes and stared at my hands, half expecting them to tremble now that everything had slowed down. They didn't. I felt tired, yes, but grounded, like I'd finally set down something heavy I'd been carrying without realizing it. In the morning, I dressed simply, comfortable slacks, a soft sweater, no armor, no performance, just myself. When my children arrived, they stood on either side of the door, both smiling too quickly. I invited them in. We sat at a small round table near the window, steam rising from our cups. For a few minutes, we spoke of nothing important: traffic, the weather, the hotel, old habits trying to find footing. Then my son set his mug down with a quiet clink.
"We owe you an explanation," he said. I didn't interrupt. He took a breath. "After Dad died, everything felt fragile. We were scared all the time, scared of losing you too, and somewhere along the way that fear turned into resentment." My daughter nodded, staring into her cup. "You needed us, and we didn't know how to need you back." I listened, not to respond, just to understand. "We told ourselves you were asking for too much, that you were dependent, but the truth is we didn't want to face how much you had carried for us." My daughter's voice cracked. "It was easier to believe you were fine without us than to admit we were failing you." There it was. Not cruelty, not hatred, but cowardice dressed up as practicality. "I never wanted to be your burden. I wanted to be your mother." My daughter's eyes filled. "I know that now." We talked for hours, not all of it gentle. There were moments of defensiveness, moments where old wounds flared, but there was also honesty, the kind that doesn't shout. I told them about the rented room, the library job, the nights I cried silently so no one would hear. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't accuse. I simply told the truth. My son looked stricken. "Why didn't you tell us?" I tried, and when I realized you couldn't hear me, I stopped speaking. Silence fell, heavy but necessary. "I thought you didn't need us anymore," my daughter whispered. "I needed you. I just needed myself more." They nodded, absorbing that. Reconciliation didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a tearful embrace followed by instant closeness. It was something slower, more fragile, like relearning a language you once spoke fluently. When I returned home a few days later, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt acknowledged. In the weeks that followed, calls came, tentative at first, then more natural. My granddaughter visited once, sitting cross-legged on my couch, asking about my life with wide, curious eyes. "I wish I'd known sooner," she said. "You know now. That's what matters." My children didn't ask me to move back, and I didn't ask to return. Some distances, once created, need time to soften. But they showed up, and that was enough. One afternoon, months later, my daughter asked me, "How did you survive those years alone?" I thought about it before answering. I stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission to live. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry it took us so long." "So am I, but we're here now." That night, after the call ended, I sat by my window watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about how easily love can be mistaken for obligation and how dangerous that confusion can be. I had come back not to shame them, but to stand in my wholeness, and in doing so, I gave them the chance to see me, not as a burden, not as a ghost, but a woman who had endured and still loved. Rebuilding trust doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives quietly, in moments so ordinary you almost miss them if you're not paying attention. It came the first time my son called just to tell me about his day. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy, just a story about a long meeting and a broken printer at work. He laughed in the middle of it, the same quick, boyish laugh he'd had as a teenager, and something inside me loosened. It came when my daughter sent me a picture of her garden, tomatoes just starting to blush red, with the message, "Thought of you, you always knew when to plant." And it came in the form of an envelope that arrived one afternoon, thick and cream-colored, my name written in my granddaughter's careful hand. Inside was a note thanking me for coming to the wedding, telling me she felt braver knowing I was there. Tucked behind it was a photo of us together, her head tilted toward mine, both of us smiling like the years between us hadn't mattered. I placed that photo on my bookshelf right beside the chipped teacup. Still, not everything healed smoothly. There were moments when old habits resurfaced, when my daughter spoke too quickly, as if afraid silence might accuse her, or when my son avoided certain topics, steering us away from the past like a road he wasn't ready to travel again. I let those moments be what they were. Healing, I had learned, is not about erasing scars. It's about learning not to reopen them unnecessarily. The first real test came when my son invited me to dinner at his house. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just dinner. I stood in my kitchen that afternoon staring at my closet longer than necessary. It surprised me how something so simple could stir so much. I chose a neutral outfit, nothing that said special occasion, nothing that whispered, "I've been waiting for this." When I arrived, his wife greeted me warmly, her smile genuine if a little tentative. The house smelled of roasted chicken and garlic, familiar, comforting. My grandchildren, older now, taller, hovered near the doorway, unsure at first, then curious. The youngest hugged me around the waist without hesitation. Dinner was normal, and that in itself felt monumental. We talked about school, about work, about nothing at all. At one point, my son asked me for a recipe, the same chicken soup I used to make when he was sick. He wrote it down carefully, asking questions, listening. That night, as I drove home, I realized something important. They weren't trying to make up for the past. They were trying to move forward. And so was I. A few weeks later, my daughter asked to meet me alone. We chose a small cafe near the park. It was late afternoon, the lights soft, children's laughter drifting in from outside. She looked nervous, stirring her drink again and again. "I need to tell you something," she said. I waited. "When Dad died, I felt like everything was on your shoulders, and somehow that scared me." I nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I was afraid that if I leaned on you, you'd break, and if I leaned on you, I wouldn't be strong enough to hold you, so I pushed you away." Her eyes filled. I told myself it was independence, but really it was fear. I reached across the table and took her hand. I was scared too, but I trusted love more than fear, and that's where we lost each other. She squeezed my hand, her grip tight and desperate. "I don't want to lose you again." "You won't, not like that." It wasn't a promise of perfection, it was a promise of honesty. As months passed, my life remained what it had become, steady, simple, mine. I kept my apartment, I kept my job at the library, I kept my routines. Reconnection didn't require me to undo the self I'd built. In fact, it strengthened it. One evening, my granddaughter called me in tears. Nothing catastrophic, a fight with her husband, a disappointment she hadn't expected to feel so deeply. "I didn't know who else to call," she said. And that undid me. I listened. I didn't rush to fix anything. I offered perspective when she asked for it, silence when she didn't. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, phone still warm in my hand. I was Nana again, not by permission, by presence. My children noticed the change too, not in me, but in themselves. They became less defensive, more reflective. They asked questions about my life now, not out of obligation, but interest. One afternoon, my son said, "You seem lighter." I smiled. "I am." "Why?" I thought about it, because I stopped waiting to be chosen. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did." So was I. There were still days when the past pressed close, when I wondered how different things might have been if we'd all been braver sooner. But regret, I'd learned, is only useful if it teaches you how to love better now. I didn't return to my children to prove a point. I returned because love doesn't keep score. And because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after being rejected is to live well enough that your presence becomes undeniable.
Time has a way of revealing what noise tries to hide.
Months turned into a year, and the rhythm between my children and me found its own quiet balance. Not the frantic closeness we once had, not the painful distance that followed, but something steadier, something earned. I was no longer the mother waiting by the phone. I was the woman whose phone rang. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves gathered along the sidewalk outside my apartment, my son asked if I would come stay with them for a few days. His wife was traveling for work, the kids were restless, and he sounded unsure, not desperate, just human. "I can come," I said, "if you'd like." "I would," he replied, without hesitation. Those few days felt like stepping into a parallel version of my life. Mornings filled with cereal bowls and half-finished homework, evenings spent cooking together, him asking me to show him how to season without measuring, laughing when he added too much salt. One night, after the children had gone to bed, we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. The air was cool, the stars faint but present. "I used to think needing someone was weakness," he said suddenly. I waited. "Then I lost you," he continued, voice low, "and I realized how much strength it takes to admit you can't do everything alone." I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the boy I raised, nor the man who had pushed me away, but the person standing between those truths. Needing isn't the problem, denying it is. He nodded, eyes shining. "I'm sorry I learned that too late." "You learned it when you were ready," I replied. "That's all any of us can do." A few weeks later, my daughter invited me to her home for dinner. She'd planned the menu carefully, texting me questions throughout the day. "Does basil go with this? Would Dad have liked this recipe?" That last message stopped me for a moment. "Yes," I typed back, "he would have." After dinner, she brought out an old photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. We sat side by side, turning pages, pointing, remembering. "I used to be angry when I looked at these," she admitted. "I thought loving you meant losing myself." "And now?" I asked. She smiled, soft and sad. "Now I see it means knowing where I came from." That night, as I drove home, I realized something had shifted again, not in them this time, but in me. I wasn't afraid of losing them anymore, because I had learned how to hold myself. The true completion of this story didn't arrive with a grand gesture. It came quietly on an ordinary morning when my granddaughter showed up at my door with a box in her arms. "I'm pregnant," she said, eyes bright and terrified all at once. I hugged her, long and steady, feeling the future unfold in my arms. "You want me to be part of this," she said, "really part of it." "I already am," I replied. Later that evening, my children came over too. We sat together, 3 generations, talking about names, about hopes, about fears that didn't need to be hidden anymore. At one point, my daughter looked at me and said, "I don't know how we let 9 years go by." I met her gaze, calm and clear. We didn't know then what we know now. There was no bitterness in the room, no blame hanging in the air, just understanding. Before they left, my son lingered at the door. "You know," he said, "when you walked into that church, I realized something." "What's that?" I asked. "I realized we hadn't rejected you because you were weak. We rejected you because you reminded us of our responsibility to love deeply, and we weren't ready for that." I nodded. "Love asks a lot, but it gives more," he added. "Yes," I said, "it does." When the door closed behind them, I stood alone in my apartment, the same one I had rebuilt my life in piece by piece, the same walls that had held my grief, my growth, my quiet victories. I looked around and felt no urge to change anything, because this place, this life was proof. Proof that rejection doesn't get the final word. Proof that dignity can survive abandonment. Proof that love, when rooted in self-respect, can outlast silence. I didn't come back to make them speechless. I came back whole. And in seeing that, they finally understood the cost of losing me and the gift of finding me again. If you're listening to this and carrying that similar silence in your own life, I want to ask you something gently. If you stopped waiting to be chosen, what kind of life could you build for yourself? Thank you for sitting with my story. If it touched you, share it with someone who might need it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine.